It's the middle of the 2nd century AD, and the Roman Empire, remade under the Caesars, is still going strong. And in the town of Smyrna, a town on the western coast of modern-day Turkey, it's game day. After a morning of gladiators, it's now time for everyone's favourite activity, public executions. Amongst those on death row are arsonists, robbers, and murderers. But the Roman proconsul then turns to an 86-year-old man, a local of Smyrna, and he says, "Take the oath of allegiance to the emperor. I will let you go. Just revile Christus," the Latin word for the Christ that the Romans had really gotten sick of the Christians proclaiming. To the proconsul's shock, the frail 86-year-old man declines. He's whisked away to be burned at the stake and pierced with a spear for good measure. That man became the first recorded martyr in church history, and that man was Polycarp of Smyrna.
Hello there.
Okay, so today we're returning to ancient history again, and so based on the comments on the Augustine video, you guys seem most interested in ancient China. So for today's question, which of these ancient Chinese figures would you most want to see covered? Emperor Qin, Sun Tzu, or Empress Wu? Now, when it comes to Polycarp of Smyrna, there's a few sources that historians use to try and unpack his life. The ones that we're going to use are The Martyrdom of Polycarp, a book written sometime between 160 and 200 AD, and for this one we don't actually know the authors, but we can assume it was probably multiple church fathers. Secondly, we have Adversus Haereses, Latin for against heresies, which was written around about 180 AD by Polycarp's disciple, Irenaeus. And then finally, we're going to be using Polycarp's own letter that he wrote to the church in Philippi sometime between 108 and 140 AD. So Polycarp was born in 69 AD. Now, interestingly, this is just a few years after the death of Paul the Apostle, and so it marks an important moment in church history where responsibility for the teachings of the church transfer from Jesus' apostles to a second generation of apostles. Think of it like going from Bulbasaur to Bayleaf, or from Michael Jordan to Kobe. And so Polycarp was adopted and raised in Smyrna by a Christian woman named Callisto. Now, we know that he was baptized at some point in his infancy or his adolescence because when a dude called Ignatius later passed through Smyrna and met Polycarp, he wrote to Polycarp making references to his baptism. Now, the other important thing about the instruction of Polycarp was that at some point before the age of 30, he was discipled by John, as in John the Apostle who wrote the Gospel of John and the Epistles of John. Now, unlike the other apostles, John was the only one who wasn't martyred, and he lived into his old age, dying perhaps even in his 90s. And so Polycarp's disciple Irenaeus wrote of how John mentored Polycarp in the same way that Polycarp mentored him.
"Don't be so sure, my young Jedi. You forget that he was once my apprentice, just as you were once his."
And John had instilled in Polycarp a deep conviction that Jesus had to be incarnated as a human, because if he wasn't, he could not have died as a substitute for humanity. Now, in modern church history, the issue of orthodoxy is around the divinity of Jesus. Was he God's son or just some bloke? But in the early church, it was the opposite. No one questioned if Jesus was divine, but people did genuinely question if he was human. And so Polycarp stood in opposition to a huge voice in ancient Christianity, Marcion. Now, Marcion taught what some have described as the gospel without Christmas. Basically, Jesus was not born of the Virgin Mary, rather he was passed through her as water through a pipe, but not actually born. Now, that might seem like splitting hairs, but the implication was huge. For Marcion, Jesus was not born, and therefore he was not a human. In fact, for Marcion, the entire God of the New Testament was a separate one from the Old Testament, and the gospel was a triumph of the benevolent New Testament God over the malevolent Old Testament God. Marcion even formed his own canon of scripture which completely excluded the Old Testament and only included a shortened version of Luke's Gospel and 10 of Paul's letters. Now, Polycarp disputed all of this because not only does Jesus affirm that God is one to a teacher of the law in Mark 12, but God goes pretty Old Testament on Ananias and Sapphira about lying about their charitable giving in the New Testament. In his letters to the Philippians, Polycarp said this: "Whoever does not confess that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is the Antichrist. And whoever does not confess the mystery of the cross is of the devil, and he is the firstborn of Satan." Now, firstly, Polycarp uses the exact same wording, specifically the term Antichrist, that John used in 1 John. So this backs up Irenaeus' claim that John discipled Polycarp. And secondly, he called Marcion the firstborn of Satan. Some accounts of Polycarp's life even say that he met Marcion face to face in Rome, where he once again called him a son of Satan. But the letter to Philippi was also important because it clarified what he saw the authority was for the second generation of church leaders. You see, the apostles had the authority of being eyewitnesses to Jesus, or in Paul's case, encountering Jesus on the road to Damascus. So when they wrote letters like 1 Peter or the Gospel of Matthew, these were treated as scripture because they were from an authoritative source. However, Polycarp was eager to stress that his words were not on par with that of his mentor John, or with any of the other apostles like Paul. As part of his letter to the Philippians, he wrote this: For neither I, nor any other like me, can attain the wisdom of the blessed and glorious Paul, who was among you and in the presence of the then living, accurately and firmly taught the word of truth, who also in his absence wrote you an epistle. Clearly then, Polycarp believed his role was to preserve the tradition of the apostles rather than to take over their authority. Finally, I'm going to finish with what I alluded to at the start, Polycarp's death. Now, Polycarp lived through the first half of the 2nd century as the bishop of his hometown Smyrna, but at age 86 he would meet his end. According to the Book of the Martyrdom of Polycarp, he actually received a prophetic vision that he would be burnt alive in Smyrna. His close advisors encouraged him to flee, but he refused, saying that it was the Lord's will that he would be a martyr. When the moment came for the proconsul to demand from Polycarp an oath of allegiance, Polycarp said this: "For 86 years I have been his servant, and he has done me no wrong, and how can I now blaspheme my king who saved me?" He was then taken to be burned at the stake and was then stabbed with a spear. His final words were, "I bless you, Father, for judging me worthy of this hour, so that in the company of the martyrs I may share the cup of Christ." Although he certainly wasn't the first Christian martyr, again 12 of the 14 designated apostles were martyred with Judas and John as the exceptions, he was the first recorded martyr. And in the martyrdom of Polycarp, the recorded account 30 years later, the authors suggest that the fires didn't actually burn Polycarp's body and that the spear was needed to finish him off. Now, in terms of recording ancient history, it's pretty close to the fact, being at absolute maximum 50 years after the event. However, there are still some reasons to take it with a grain of salt. Firstly, other accounts of Polycarp's death say that rather than being needed to finish him off, the spear was simply used as a direct punishment for not burning incense to the Roman emperor. Either way, both attest to him refusing to bow the knee to the emperor and to being killed with both fire and spear. Secondly, there's issues surrounding the speed in which Polycarp was killed, as this would be breaking the legal process of Rome. Even Jesus was afforded a trial, and the Jews had to lay the charge of Jesus claiming to be king and therefore being an enemy of Caesar before Pontius Pilate. Polycarp was directly asked by the proconsul of Asia to take the oath of allegiance, so that could potentially explain the rapid execution. Not to mention that the book's authors were Romans as well and were well aware of the legal process, so it'd hardly be smart to make up something that subverts their own legal norms. Either way, whether Polycarp had a vision of his own death, whether it was a rapid or slow build up to the execution, or whether the spear was needed because the fire wouldn't kill him, a couple of things are clear. He was adamant that Jesus was born a human, adamant that his authority was not the same as the apostles, and would rather die a martyr than bow the knee to the emperor. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, don't forget to hit the like button to let YouTube know that this video should appear when people search up Polycarp. Next time in Insiders and Exiles, we're looking at the British emancipist William Wilberforce, and we can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.